slightly unsettling when you come into a room and there's a walkie-talkie on your seat. A very good morning to you. Welcome to the 2025 Festival of Politics here in the Scottish Parliament. Welcome back to those of you who have been here before, and a very warm welcome, special welcome to those for whom it is the first time. My name is Liam MacArthur. I am one of the two Deputy Presiding Officers here at Holyrood. It's my pleasure to be hosting this In Conversation event. It's a special In Conversation with the brilliant academic and writer Professor Danny Dorling, brought to you in partnership with the Scottish Futures Forum and the David Hume Institute. If you're keen to share your thoughts throughout proceedings, you can do so using the @VisitScotParl account on Instagram. Now, let me introduce our guest. Professor Danny Dorling is the Halford Mackinder Professor of Geography at the University of Oxford. He explores and maps the changing social, political and medical geographies of Britain and further afield, concentrating on social and spatial inequalities to life chances and how these can be narrowed. Or, in Danny's own words, I'm a geographer who looks at numbers. I get to play with maps and graphs, and I get to talk about confrontational ideas and things that are near to the bone. In collaboration with other academics, Danny has published more than 25 books on issues related to social inequalities and hundreds of journal papers on issues including housing, health, employment, education and poverty, and the interconnections between all these topics. Much of his work is available freely through open access. In 2006, Danny worked with a group of researchers to remap the world, leading to a collection of world maps that look very different to conventional maps as territories are resized according to their area of interest. His recent books include Inequality and the 1%, Shattered Nation, Population 10 Billion, and 7 Children. His latest book is called The Next Crisis, What We Think About the Future. It was described by his son, who he persuaded to proofread it, I gather, as a truthful but a hopeful book, as it offers solutions for tackling the range of concerns people across the world have expressed as worrying. These include the biggest global concern by far, the cost of living crisis, coupled with inequality and poverty. After that came worry about employment and immigration, climate change, and violence and crime. Like so many of his books, The Next Crisis has been hailed as a winning mix of accessible stories and statistics in its clear-sighted description of each issue that then sets out a compelling agenda for action and solution. Before his career in academia, Danny was employed as a play worker in children's play schemes and in preschool education. He's a member of the Academy of the Learned Societies in the Social Sciences, a former honorary president of the Society of Cartographers, and a patron of Road Peace, the national charity for road crash victims. So can I ask you please to put your hands together and welcome Professor Danny Dorling. Welcome, Danny. That point at the end about your time in preschool education, was it a natural kind of transition from there to social geography? What kind of led you there?
It's when you have to do these mini CVs, they're called bios. You need to write something about your past, and my truthful, sad past is that I went to university at 18 and never left. But I did work in playgroups before I was 18, a little bit, and I did work every summer after 18 running play schemes in the rose-tinted, lovely old days when local councils could employ play workers, and you would sort of be in charge of a public park, but you weren't, because any number of children can turn up. And you could have 100, 200, 300. How did I get into it? My mum used to run playgroups and set them up in the 1970s. She was part of what was called the Preschool Playgroups Association. This is part of the revolution for young people. You won't probably know what a playgroup is now because we have nurseries and it's become taken over by profit. But in the 60s and 70s, women got together, almost entirely women, to say that you didn't want to be stuck at home trying to look after a 2, 3, 4, 5-year-old. It made sense to come together for 2 or 3 hours. You'd set up a committee, you'd rent a church hall, you might even employ a worker, although often the amount of money you could charge was so little that nobody was making money. You'd get dough and water and sand, and you would occupy the children, but the main reason was for the mothers. It was so that you weren't in isolation. And back then, it's a long time ago, back then a few boys like me could work there as well as girls. It became more divided. So that's the story. I've got to say, the thing going through my head at the moment is enormous respect for presiding officers, because presumably you normally sit there. And I've never sat here before. And this form of a parliament is brilliant for not being confrontational, unless you sit here. and so I'm not complaining, but, you know, it is kind of slightly intimidating from the point of view of somebody here that everybody's lined up looking at you.
It's even more intimidating because it is verboten to be in this part of the chamber when the chamber is sitting. So to find myself sat here as a deputy president, it feels wrong in so many ways.
Okay. Thank you.
So that move into social geography, was that something that you had an interest in, or I mean, how did that come about?
Its parents and its background. My mum used to run Labour committee rooms. You know, I'm from a political family. Growing up, our front room during local elections would be full of people, and coloured paper. This was pre-computers, for knocking up on doors to get people to vote. So I grew up in a political household. I didn't know I did. I just thought it was a normal household. But grew up with those issues. I also became aware very early on of the divisions in the neighbourhood where I lived and the schools that I went to. Later on, I worked out that actually I grew up in one of the very few parts of England where one of the richest neighbourhoods abuts one of the poorest. So it was an unusual place to grow up. And I've written about it in the past. Children's futures in my neighbourhood, this is East Oxford, in my neighbourhood of East Oxford, you could predict what a child would do if you knew which quarter of the neighbourhoods they came from. Didn't matter how imaginative or lazy they were. You know, if they were imaginative and hard-working from certain areas, they were going to work in a car factory regardless as a boy, or become a mum and learn to cook and sew as a girl. If they came from the upper middle class area, they were probably going to go to university. And so I grew up thinking that geography determined probably more than it actually does, because of the part of the country I grew up on. I can go on and on about this. You have to shut me up about differences. But we're very affected by our families. So I'm going to do it. The fastest way I can tell you about my social position is really, really quick. My father was a doctor. I'm a doctor's son. Now, for all the adults in the room, you instantly know what that means. You know who I was in the school. I was the doctor's son. And I think you've got to be pretty thick-skinned not to realise that that puts you in a particular position. In one case, it's quite important. It means people are less likely to beat you up because my father was the doctor for the neighbourhood I grew up in. So an acute sense. And we had a big house. We had a BT telephone line, you know.
It sat on its own table next to the front door, presumably.
Oh, yeah, well, there was a ring, but, you know, actually having... And this is, you know, I was born in the late 60s, this is the 70s. So a lot of things. And we're all of us affected acutely by the families we grew up in. And most of my politics was decided before I was 18. And it may be the case for many of you. You'll change some of your opinions, but largely what you believe, I'm looking at the people over there, I'm guessing some of you may be about 16. If not by now, you've already decided the things you'll probably believe the rest of your life. Slightly movable, but less and less. I also grew up in a mixed race family. So 2 of my brothers are black, 1 was white. And if you know about the 1970s, that really matters. So it's those kind of experiences.
Yeah, and I mean, I have to say, I became increasingly conscious of the experience of my 2 sons growing up being the sons of the local MSP, and particularly as you get closer to elections and there's much more debate around the outcome of that election. I'm fairly sure there are experiences that they haven't shared with me, but have had a profound effect.
Yeah, I mean, the interesting thing is my mother was the powerhouse in our family. You know, she was the driving one. And she's now 83. She's of an age where people start to die, so I go to quite a lot of funerals in Oxford. And the fascinating thing, well, I don't like funerals, right? But the fascinating thing is the eulogy, and the eulogy for the women in their 80s, very odds on, and this is my friend's parents, is about the things they did, the committee they set up, the community hut they got built, the play scheme that they created, the local library that they supported. We built all of this in the 60s and 70s. The tragedy now, politically, is you're watching the last children's centre be shut. You're desperately trying to keep open, this is in England, keep open the things that people created when I was a child, and it was women. In Oxford, it was all women, partly because the men were mostly working that did it. But I am typified by my father's occupation because it's very, very posh.
Yeah. I mean, that point about inequality, which clearly is at the heart of much of your work, you focus on areas of housing, health, employment, education, poverty. There's clearly an interconnectedness there. But are any of those areas, is the inequality in any of those areas particularly a concern to you, that has a profound effect on the life outcomes for individuals?
Well, some have got dramatically better. Inequalities in education have got better. Your future used to be completely determined by an exam called the 11 Plus in England, which I luckily avoided because I would have failed it. You know, people were confined, 80% of people were confined to, you are going to go to a secondary modern and you're going to leave school at 14 or 15. Whereas that, in my view, has got much better. And interestingly, to me, European comparisons of education show that one of the things that the UK is good at, compared to other European countries, and in general we're bad at many things, one of the things that we're good at is that our education system tends to increase social mobility more than average, because we don't have this division at age 11 anymore. And that's despite having the largest private school sector in Europe, which is very, very aggressive, obviously, for mobility. Health is the key one. Health is the thing that matters. As people get older, you'll begin to realise they talk more and more about health, and all the rest of it doesn't matter. And health is the saddest one. We've had, for a number of years, rising child mortality in the UK. I mean, that's almost unheard of. It's low, but going up. 10, 20-year differences in life expectancy, still depending on what part of the city you're in. You know, the bottom of the Leaf Road up to the top, Newtown. You know, I could predict the map for this city, and it's a similar map across the UK of just who is likely to make it into their 90s, who will die in their 80s. You can see my social group when I describe the funerals I'm going to. Who will it still be normal to die in their 70s? Who is 3, 4, or 5 times more likely, even though it's rare, to die in their 30s from overdoses in drugs or from an accident or something else? And why we can't reduce those differences in chances between people, and why our health is so poor in the UK as compared to the continent that we live in. You know, and that, and you can take it, as soon as you take it to an individual case, it gets very emotive. I won't upset you about them and do it. When I talk statistics, it's like emotion with the tears wiped off. But I could describe situations that are happening in the UK now, and you would find it very, very upsetting. And it's unnecessary. It is patently unnecessary. Country with some of the best health in Europe, Finland. At one point a few years ago, Finland got its infant mortality down to 2.1 babies dying per 1,000 born. Right? That's the lowest in the history of our species, ever. Over achievements. And you've got to ask, why do we not work harder to avoid some of these tragedies in people's lives?
The point you were making there about statistics being kind of the emotion with the tears wiped off, actually a lot of your work is the reverse. You're using maps, you're using kind of visual descriptions of the issues you're talking about as a way of communicating them more effectively. Here in the Parliament, we're wrestling with ways in which we can engage the public more in debates around issues using citizens' panels, citizens' assemblies, things like that. I mean, do you see it as a valuable mechanism for engaging people more in those public debates, that having a kind of visual representation of what you're talking about brings it home to them more clearly?
I think there are ways. I mean, I struggle over the effective ways of doing this. It's incredible watching examples of citizens' panels around the world having big, big effects. The most famous recently is Ireland, where a whole nation had its view changed, simply by talking to each other. But it's what sparks things in your head. You know, if you imagine with this chamber, if we were to take you lot, who are all sitting there quite anonymously now, and move you around so that we take the spread of you from here to here, and those of you from the most affluent families end up sitting here, and we sort you out, and then we talk about what's likely to happen to you in a future Scotland if things don't change. And so we've put those of you from the poorest backgrounds down here. Now you can typify the stories that'll be here: more chance of drug addiction, more chance of not having enough food, more chance of not being able to have holidays ever. But up here, where we're going to take the people who are most privileged in this audience, you lot are going to be frightened. You lot will be frightened that you're going to lose this, that the rest of you are going to come for your money, for your wealth, bring in a wealth tax, that you might not succeed, that you might not get to, I don't know, St Andrews, Edinburgh, whatever you have to do. Because if you're here, you have to go to an elite. Be thankful, because it's now an elite Scottish university. Right? Young people from Scotland do not come down to England anymore, for obvious reason. But you have to go to an elite university, so your freedom is curtailed here. You can't just go and work at 18, which might be more interesting, because you might be sick of school. And then you've got to meet and marry the right person, and you've got to have a successful career. So, you know, if I could create a visualization, and I'm generalizing you lot, and there's lots of happy things in life, but you are in by far the most exceptionally unequal of Scandinavian countries. If I was to compare you even to Iceland, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Finland, you wouldn't believe how much better, well, Iceland's a bit small, let's forget about that, it's far away, but you wouldn't believe how much better life is for people in these other countries in the north of Europe. People don't tend to talk about Scotland like that because Scotland is sitting just above England. And Scotland does much better in England in many, many ways, right? So you can be self-congratulatory about how much better at education this country has been for centuries and is now, how much better about many, many things. We tend to take our circumstances for granted. We just say, this is how it is. But it can be better and get better, and it can be much worse. This place could go like the USA. It's not impossible. We could have 1 in 13 families in parts of the city being evicted every year, which is what you see in Baltimore in the USA. you could have thousands and thousands of people in future sleeping in their cars and vans because we get a massive rise in homelessness. Things can get worse, things can get better. They rarely stay exactly the same.
I'm going to give you the opportunity to come back with your own questions very shortly, but one more from me just now. The disconnect often between the issues that experts are telling us are the most important and that we should be most concerned about don't always map over to the issues about which the public and by extension voters think are the most important or feel most concerned about. Yeah. So are there any thoughts or advice that you have on how bringing those two things more into alignment? I mean, I say this and I declare an interest as somebody who's about to go into an election in 8 months' time. Persuading people about what are the important things that they should base their vote on is a challenge. That's not how it works. The electorate get to choose what the issues are that any election's fought on. But that disconnect, and the one that probably stands out is the crisis in relation to biodiversity. Whereas there's a common understanding of the extent of the climate crisis, but the crisis in biodiversity is one that doesn't have the same kind of salience for voters, but experts are telling us matters and we should be concerned about.
Yeah. Now, I mean, I work in the geography and environment department where conservation and climate change are key issues. And we're living through the 6th mass extinction. I was talking to the person putting me up this morning, and she was saying how terrible this is, and I kind of thought, how do you cheer people up about the 6th mass extinction? Which is a terrible thing, but the kind of good thing about it is most of it has already happened. I can say that tritely because if we were to see species go extinct at the rate they have for the last 100 years, for the next 100 years, that's game over. There are no mammals left, including us. And we have had other mass extinctions before. So it's a terrible time, but that's where we are. The importance of not being stupid, now we know what effect we have on the environment, just in our own self-interest, should be rather obvious, but we're not very good at changing it around quickly. When you survey people about what matters to them, and surveys are almost always biased towards the middle class upwards. Poorer people are not asked their opinions, they're not included in surveys around the world, often because they can't be reached by the internet or why. When you ask people about what matters to them, the environment ranks really low. It doesn't rank low amongst young university students in Europe. It doesn't rank low amongst the affluent, who don't have to worry so much about other things. There it's very high, but it ranks low and it's been dropping over time. I want to keep mentioning things that the UK or Scotland's good at. One of the things we're best at in the world is that only 9% of us believe that climate change is a hoax. We have the lowest rate in the world of thinking that climate change is made up and is not happening. It's still 9%, and I should be kind of, apologies to anybody sitting here who thinks it's a hoax. We can talk about that later if you want. But, in terms of successful politics, how did we get to that position? It was a really interesting, quiet deal between political parties and the media about how, and it could be being broken now, but even in the UK, with the best press and media in the world over this issue, and the best politicians in the world over this issue, not necessarily other ones, but this one, even in the UK, the importance of climate slips over time because of fatigue, boredom, and maybe a bit too much crying wolf. Only 12 years to save the planet. If you say that too many times, people get skeptical. But also because other issues are really important and rise. The biggest issue in the UK still is cost of living crisis, inequality and poverty, and just how to get by. And that includes for the middle class. The second biggest issue is unemployment. Even though we're talking about how low it is in some of the parts where we live, Where I come from, we have a real unemployment rate of only 1% because you can't afford to live there. You need to get a bedroom. Once you've got a bedroom, there are jobs. But unemployment is the second biggest fear of people around the world, but also in the UK. And of the people at school here, you're worrying, or I presume you worry, who's going to want me? Who's going to give me a job? What am I going to get in future? And realising that that's such a big fear in people helps partly explain why something like climate isn't seen as important, but also how easy it is to scare people about these other people who are going to come and take your jobs or do these terrible things. You know, you might think, how on earth do they manage to scare people about the nice people who come to our countries to live with us, which we should be very grateful for. I may sound sceptical. Remember I said I grew up in a family in the 70s with 2 black brothers. I find it very hard to be tolerant of people not liking people from outside. How do we manage to get people so scared about immigration? Because so many of us are scared about our own future, and are we needed? Will we be able to put our children into school? Will we be able to see the doctor or go to hospital? Will you be able to get a house? And what's the threat to that? And so I think it's really important to look at attitudes and fears, because if you don't address cost of living crisis and you don't address the fear of unemployment, then people will use that to rise up in your mind to what they want you to be frightened about, partly because they don't want you to worry about that inequality I've talked about, because some of them think that that inequality is a really, really good thing, because they tend to think that they're much cleverer than you and they should decide what happens and you should just let them be in charge. And a very trivial description of politics in the UK, but you know, it's one of our fundamental divisions in the UK, is those politicians who think that a tiny number of people are clever, tended to have gone to exclusive schools, tended never to have mixed with other people, and those politicians who've got more faith in people more generally. And that's a fundamental political divide between right and left.
Thank you. I think that's set the scene. It's now over to you. I'm going to open up to questions. If you could put your hand up, keep it up until I point at you, and then wait until the little red light on your microphone comes on, and then you will be able to speak. If you could keep the questions or comments reasonably brief, we'll get in more that way. And I'm going to start with the gentleman third row back and 2 in.
Thank you very much for your interesting work and explanation of it. My question is very specific. It's on the fall in violent crime in the last 20, 30 years. Could you help me understand that? And do you think it relates to the elimination of lead in petrol? I'm very interested in this question and any insights you have on it.
Thank you. I'll tell you what I think I can. Obviously, well, I'm not an expert on almost anything. I'm a geographer. And the lovely thing about geography is we're allowed to study volcanoes and peoples and rivers and inequality in health, right? Also, the lead question is sort of interesting. I haven't written on lead. For those who don't know, we in the UK and most of Europe have tried to get rid of lead in our pipes, in children's toys. The younger people here are largely lead-free. You're very, very lucky. In the USA, they still have lead. Lead is not good for your brain, and it's a poison in general. I laugh slightly at this because I grew up in the Green Road roundabout in East Oxford, which had the highest exposure to lead in the early 1970s. Before the M40 was built, more traffic going to London. They used to take my milk teeth when they came out and were sliced to measure the lead exposure of me. So if you're thinking he's really annoying and he's not very clever, you know, I'm actually an example of you can absorb an enormous amount of lead and still be a professor at university, but it's bad for you. Violence. We had a rise in violence, well, murder is the ultimate way in which we count it, a rise in violence to around about the year 2000. and I wrote papers with criminologists on this, looking at where was the rise. It was in the poorest areas. Who were committing the murders? It was largely young men who were poor. They were largely murdering their friends. In half of the cases, stereotype, they were drunk. If you're murdered, you are rarely murdered by a stranger. You're often murdered by somebody who really likes you, who loves you. But it's a fairly depressing topic. The shock is seeing it going down. Now, there was a lobby of people who wanted to claim that the murder rate and violence in general was going up because we got rid of the death penalty at the end of the 60s. People do not think I won't have a fight just in case I hit somebody too hard and they die because of the death penalty. And the fact the murder rate went down shows that that's not the case. It's certainly good to get rid of the lead, but my gut feeling, without any evidence about why we got less violent and why people in a lot of countries, particularly in Europe, got less violent, and it's men, much, much more violent than women. Same curve everywhere, fascinating curve of men and women peaking around about 19, 20, 21 and then going down, but in some countries being 10 times less violent than in others, but always this pattern. And here's my bias, and you can see, because of my mother, I think it's a change in the mums. I think as the position of women changed over the decades, from my grandmother's time when you were essentially subhuman, you only just got the vote, you don't speak, through to my mum's 1970s generation of battling women, bringing up little boys like me and my 3 brothers, and telling us not to hit. You know, we were still, and we measured this, we had the most violent playgrounds in Europe, in the UK. You know, I had to fight as a child. More and more assertive women and mothers, and the idea that this is just not how you behave. I used to be, this is not a proud, I was the second hardest in the 3rd year, if that means anything. Okay? I can remember Richard Thomas finally getting his legs round and crashing my head back on the concrete. And that was the point when I started to learn, because I couldn't win by beating up anymore. But sadly, second highest in the 3rd year also means I was probably a bully. I was big. The change in our attitudes to violence, that it's something that is impressive at all, I think it's more that than the lead. Certainly good to get rid of the lead. Certainly violence levels are higher in the USA. But it's the society and what the society tolerates. And ridiculous things like letting people have guns, you know, which is fairly obvious to you. Like, I don't know, trying to antagonize you. There may be somebody sitting here who thinks we really ought to have guns in this society, but it's probably unlikely, you know, and that helps. But our societies are changing very quickly, and the changing position of women in society is a huge influence on how attitudes have changed. And I think that's why the violence has gone down. You've also got to remember, I mean, we used to play British Bulldog in playgrounds. I used to get comics which were all about fighting Germans and shooting people with machine guns, right? This, and Scotland even more so than England, you know, we are the centre of the largest empire the world has ever known, based on being highly effective at killing people in other places, right? So getting down from one way of putting it is a proud history of our forces, but the other way is thinking, as more than one Prime Minister has said, we did invade uninvited 90% of the current members of the United Nations, you know, and reducing the violence in our society is harder than in other places because of a violent history.
I'm beginning to wonder why second hardest in the 3rd year wasn't in the biography I was given of you earlier on, but I'll make sure that's amended for future. And just to warn the lead-free members of the audience, we will be expecting to hear from you at some point later on this morning, so get your questions prepared. I've got a question there in the middle of the 2nd row, and then I'll come to the back after that.
Hi. I just wanted to, I found your
the information about your early life, the working with children, very interesting, because I've heard you remark various times about is it the child payment in Scotland being ahead of anything else equivalent in Europe. How impressed you were about that. And I wonder if you would just say a little bit about that and whether it's still the case that there's some small thing that we might be getting right with young people in Scotland.
So the majority of books I've written are about inequality, and you always use children as the argument about inequality because it's easiest, right? Almost nobody blames a child aged 5 for the situation they find themselves in. You know, nobody says, oh, couldn't they have tried a bit harder when they were 4? You know, persuaded their parents, you know, okay. So child poverty is politically easy. Politically easy, you know. You've got to be a bit nasty to think it's okay for children to be poor. And the tragedy is there are some people who do think that. And whole countries are affected. Your standard poverty survey across Europe is you ask people, should children have a spare pair of shoes? Should they have a warm winter coat? Should they be able to go out for a meal once a month with their family? Should they be able to get birthday presents? Should they have a mobile phone at the age of 12? And you ask these questions and they tip up to ones where you get more people saying, actually, that's a bit much. And then you work out what do the majority of the population say most children should have, how many don't have that, should they have a holiday once a year? A third of children don't have a holiday once a year. And that sets your poverty level. We can't run the poverty survey in the USA, and haven't been able for decades, because a large number of people in the USA say children should only have what their parents can afford and don't have a sense that this is wrong. Scottish child payment, you've got to remember I'm very, very, very English, right? And we've been battling for years and years and years with Child Poverty Action Group and so on about child poverty. It's the basic thing that social scientists do. We tend to be political, we tend to want the world to get better, tend to worry about child benefit. I can remember a colleague of mine getting an award at a conference because she'd helped persuade a government to increase child benefit on the first child by £1 and something through lots of evidence. And then the situation of our children in particular gets worse. George Osborne takes away child benefits for the third and subsequent child unless you can prove you've been raped. I mean, unbelievable. George Osborne, not a nice person, but manages to persuade the rest of the politicians down where I live that this is somehow okay. Torsten Bell, we used to run the Resolution Foundation and produced a statistic, maybe 2 years ago, that 56% of children with 2 or more siblings in England, 56% were going seriously hungry several times a month, not just peckish. Well, a majority of all our children, right, not just poor, all of our children in families of 3, almost all 3, hardly ever 4. And that's because of the poorer children and because of this. And you get lots of, well, what is the solution? What can you do? And the basic solution, and we've known for decades, is money. Like the basic solution to being very, very poor is having a bit more money. Just to be able to buy food so you don't go hungry and to put in the meter so you don't get cold at winter. Right? They're really, really important things. And so that your children carry on going up in height and don't get shorter. And the mechanism, I mean, long term, you want to arrange society so that this is just unimaginable. But in the short term, it's money. And it's made through benefit payments. And if you're clever, you give them to the mother, normally, which gets easier, rather than the father. And if you have a cost of living crisis and everything suddenly costs 30% more, you do it fast. And to sit down in England, looking at other countries in Europe and what they do, the lowest child poverty rate was in Norway, less than 10%. And then to suddenly see during the pandemic, a country introduce a payment. I think it was £10 a week for children under 6 originally. and then increase that payment to all children in families receiving any kind of benefit, and that's argument of, you know, heads around about £30. £4,000 for a family of 3, in effect. Funding that payment out of a slightly greater redistribution in the UK as a whole, but massively less than Germany, France and Spain or any normal European country. You know, don't think it's that progressive in Scotland. He does better than England. But stunning. And now we are beginning to measure the effects and to see the effects. And we shouldn't have to do this. But the height differences you can see there in the surveys. Yeah, it's an incredible thing. Or, as I said before, it's not reported in the press in London. So when I do talks in the South for the last few years, invariably, I've talked about our child poverty rates. I've talked about how many children have no holiday, don't do this, go hungry, how many babies have never been washed in warm water in Oxford, because once you can't turn on the heat anymore, and a baby never gets used to being washed in cold water. This is Oxford. And I say, what can you do? And I say, there's a country in Europe which has done this, and I describe the scheme, and I get the audience to guess. And it always takes them more than 10 countries before they realise it's Scotland. And then my kind of punchline or joke is, but, you know, obviously that's such a different country and they speak a different language and they've got a different culture, and we couldn't possibly do what they do in Scotland here, could we? But no, it's an incredible thing. And I'm English and I'm out of it, and we're in the Parliament, but I'm not involved in Scottish politics. But I'm sure there's been an enormous amount of quiet talking to each other amongst MSPs about, I don't like this, I do like this, and at the moment it seems to me it's still off the table and accepted that even as the number of children in Scotland still goes down, because like everywhere else you're having less of them, that's why it gets cheaper, that this is not something which is debated as, shall we let them go hungry or not? Right, and I think it's very, very impressive. I really worry about how much it's hated in London. The other unmentionable in London, I'm exaggerating slightly, is in the Department of Education in London, you're not allowed to mention Scotland. Because you're not allowed to mention about school exclusions and suspensions. In England, we have the highest rate in Europe of expelling children from schools. Do anything you're out. There's a school near me where they expelled 11% of children in 1 year. Not all of them forever, but it's a terrible thing being expelled from school, right? So there's fascinating political differences within the UK. But the nasty thing that happens in England is that often what occurs in Scotland isn't reported because it's seen as, well, that's madness. You couldn't possibly afford to do that. Or how can you have discipline in a school if you can't expel people at the rate we do in England? And the expelling is all about trying to get your school up to league tables. Or to give you another one, because some of you are in uniform, there are only 2 other countries in Europe which have school uniforms. That's Ireland and Malta, former colonies. People often talk about uniform and say, without uniform, you'd all be very badly disciplined. You know, you'd be all over the place. We have countries in Europe where children go to school without wearing school uniform, and they're amazingly better behaved than we are still. But we are much better behaved in our schools than we used to be. Sorry.
I mean, you may have been second hardest in the 3rd year, but I actually managed to get expelled from school, which was then rescinded 24 hours later. But yes, it's not unheard of north of the border, it has to be said. Right, I had a question at the very back. I'm then going to come over to this side, and I'll probably take the chap at the end. In fact, I tell you what, should we go for 2, 3 questions, and then you two questions, right? We'll go to the woman at the back there, and then we'll come over to the lady second from the back there. First yourself.
Great, thank you so much. You speak so powerfully using statistics, but one of the challenges that we have in our political discourse is that it feels like there's a number for everything, you know, so people just throw numbers back and forward. So I'm really interested in your views on how we improve statistical literacy in our political discourse. And then my second question, if I can just sneak one in, is if you were able to focus the minds of the people in this chamber when they're working on 3 or 4 really good quality statistics to improve the outcomes for Scotland, what would those be in your mind? Thank you.
I'm going to go to that other question, even though that will make it 3 questions. To the lady there, yeah.
I was just wanting to ask you your ideas about universal basic income. And I mean that, I know it's got many different ideas about it, but I mean at the level of a proper, modest, but minimum income for everybody. And obviously that means then it needs to be paid for, and so I think then it needs to be taxing the wealthy. Would that change the social geography?
Okay, I'll do that one first because it's easier, but it is part of the answer to your question. So universal basic income has been argued for about, I don't know, at least 20, 25 years. Guy Standing ran the Basic Income Network worldwide. There have been hundreds of trials. It is the idea that all of you, from the age of 18, would simply get an amount of money every month from the government just for being alive. And then the question is how much? And it's a basic income. You might think, why on earth would we do this? It's efficiency. That rather than having a huge, complicated set of means-tested, you know, are you so poor we need to let you off your TV license, or do you need some money for this? Or it just makes sure that everybody can get through life, and you fund it from the people who've got more money to the people who've got less. I've always thought that at a fundamental level, this is coming in, it will come in, because it's so similar to the idea of unemployment benefit in the 1880s. Unemployment benefit, there wasn't any anywhere. It was seen as complete madness that you would actually give people money when they couldn't work, because they should simply try really hard to find work or die, right? That was the common view. Unemployment benefits begin to come in ever so tinily, and schemes to look after poor, we debated it. Now the idea that you'd let somebody die in the gutter's gone. I think we're going to get it. It won't probably be here, but whenever you say that, it always ends up being the place you say it'll be the last place. Somebody very famous once said the last place that there'll be revolution is Russia, and got it wrong. We already have it in many ways. We have it in terms of the state pension. We have it in terms of child credits. We have it in various ways already, but other parts of the world will have it more. There are different ways in which you can bring it in. You can do it rather like, if you remember the idea of stopping people smoking, being able to buy cigarettes from a certain age. I'm not quite sure where that's got to. You know, there could be an age where we say, if you turn 18 in this year, you qualify, and then the 18-year-olds next year, and so on. You could bring it in at a very tiny rate. Gordon Brown, when he was Chancellor, funded, I think it's Jane Falkenham, but I could have got the name wrong, to do a micro-simulation model of bringing it in across all of Europe. You might think, why would you want, this is when we were in the EU, why would you want a basic income across Europe? Maybe 1,000 or 2,000 euros a year. Because it's so much more efficient than trying to run 27 different tax and benefit models when you've got a labour market that people are allowed to move around. You know, one problem the EU has is all these separate models and entitlements of a population who can move. If you're simply to give everybody, say, 2,000 euros a year in Europe, that money goes a hell of a long way on a far-flung island in a poor part of the Mediterranean, or a poor part of the west coast of Scotland, and it's the kind of encouragement makes it easier to stay there. It doesn't go that far in London, but it's the beginning. So we've had experiments. Sorry, and so your question. Different countries have different levels of statistical literacy. You can see it in what their newspapers give their public. You can see it in whether they include graphs or numbers, how they report elections. If anybody wants to do a dissertation or a study on this, just look at how elections are reported and the run-up to elections in newspapers in different countries, and whether the population is shown a graph done in 2 dimensions where they've worked out one factor analysis and another of what are the most salient issues. And there are European countries in which factor analyses are presented to the general public on the front page of their newspaper. We don't put in graphs at all, let alone that. So you can see the difference. I think Donald Trump is usually helpful when it comes to statistical literacy, because he epitomizes and shows that it is entirely possible to say things that are completely untrue. You know, and at least the BBC is still brave enough to say, I do worry at what point the BBC is going to kind of bow down to Donald and not point out that that was a lie. But, you know, at least they're still doing it. But I think it's useful to see how bad things can get when it gets that. I've done one thing. I won't try to do... I'm not going to come from England and from Oxford and preach what this Parliament and this nation is impressive in the UK for what it achieves and does. It never feels like that. You go to any country, anywhere in the world. I went to Oslo, and I was in a place similar to this, as big as this, except there were babies. You know, that's different. There may be a baby, it's very quiet, but there were babies in the audience. This is 10, 15 years ago. Normal to have babies. And I made the stupid mistake of saying, congratulations on achieving the lowest rate of child poverty in the world. And there were these shouts saying, how dare you say that? Our rate's terrible. It's really bad. Don't you understand how bad it is? And that's why they had the lowest rate of child poverty in the world, because they care. The most important thing is to care. Once you stop caring, then things can get really, really bad. There's a danger in England that we're not caring about the health service because 1 in 10 people can, and every year 1 in 10 adults is paying for private healthcare. And when you get to a point when your ruling group doesn't need the NHS anymore, you are really in danger of losing it. So that's the key thing, is caring. I don't mind, well, I do mind, obviously, I'm very opinionated. But the way for politicians who want to do things that aren't helpful to win is to get you to stop caring about the stuff that matters and get you to get transfixed about something else. And the really bad ones start wars, you know, just so that, you know, that diverts attention. And that, it's not all as Machiavellian as that. But if you believe that people are inherently unequal and that you are very clever and that most people are just there to labour, then you spend your political life lying to the electorate to get their vote. And that is part of our political history. And it would be great if we can get out of that. And other countries in Europe have got out of that. People really do respect each other as human beings that are all pretty able and equal, and not the idea that there's a small class of brilliant people who require 50, 60 or 70,000 pounds a year spent on their education because they have such wonderful brains they need to be made into prime ministers. Yeah.
I'm not going to go to the baby in the chamber here, who I have to say is behaving impeccably, but I'm going to go to the young man just in front on the left-hand side, who's in a uniform and clearly going to be very well behaved.
I was wondering about what are some of the things you would introduce into countries in terms of like climate change reduction, because obviously you're a geographist and you know like a lot of things on that topic.
Reduction, sorry?
Climate change reductions.
Reduction. Well, there's huge variations between countries. Is that the question on climate change reduction or our pollution levels?
Pollution levels.
Yeah. There are enormous differences, and the differences in attitude. So the most progressive countries really want to now changing things by 2030, 2035. The majority of the heating in a room like this, but also the heating in the homes, are fossil fuel heated in many countries. Not just heat pumps or communal heating systems, but solar and so on. Here, the majority of our heating is gas. And we congratulate ourselves because it's better than coal, which we used to do. So we say, our carbon footprint has gone down, right? But we're still burning gas, and we're still not planning to be like a normal European country that is Denmark. I was in the Danish parliament many years ago at the point where they got to the majority of their electricity was being supplied by wind power. And I think they didn't have a Green Party, you know. And I asked, why isn't there a Green Party? They said, because all the parties are green, which is a strange concept. And then I asked them the question, what do you do when the wind doesn't blow in Denmark? And they said, the amount of power you're allowed to use goes down. We turn off the washing machines, and for a few days we all smell a bit. And I think it was a joke. This is a parliamentarian in Denmark.
Are they still a parliamentarian?
But different attitudes. We're going to have the gas is going to run out anyway. But it's worth trying to be nearer to the forefront of the world in doing these things rather than a laggard. The forefront in Europe is probably Germany. The forefront in the world is China. And yeah, the great news is that the efficiency of solar panels is increasing, the cost is going down. The danger is that there is a lobby from the fossil fuel industry that's incredibly clever at managing to find ways to get politicians in certain parts of the world to carry on supporting what's left of their industries. And you're going to end up being an undeveloped country if you still champion. I know we're not in Aberdeen at least, right? But it's not the place you want to be. And I'm not particularly green, it's just obvious. Yeah, but thank you.
Is the challenge though, and this is a very live debate at the moment, that consensus you were talking about earlier in terms of man-made climate change has been pretty rock solid for a decade and more in Scottish and in UK politics. There is a real likelihood of that breaking down in the build-up to the next Scottish election and potentially subsequent elections. But the challenge for parliamentarians of all stripes is translating the support for action to tackle climate change and delivery of the action that's required, the behavioural change that's needed. You cannot necessarily just innovate your way out of it. And the behavioural changes, even the rollout of insulation programmes where you're offering it for free, are met with resistance from people who don't want their house turned upside down for a few weeks and whatnot. And that's the kind of low-hanging fruit. What needs to come next is action that is challenging for people who accept, believe and support the drive towards net zero, but who are challenged and more resistant to the actions that can help deliver that.
It's really hard work, and where it's been done in countries, it's work. My old geography teacher is still working. She's older than me, so you know she shouldn't be working for too long. But she's one of there's a couple of people in Powys in Wales, big county, very rural county, and she's employed by the county to go round, and she's very Welsh, and persuade people to accept the grants to get the insulation put in their houses. And she does it really well. But that's because she's local, she's Welsh, and it makes a huge change. It is not easy retrofitting a very old housing stock in a country that hasn't looked after its housing. You know, our model of housing generally is you don't need to do much to it. The next idiot's going to buy it at an inflated price from you. It's just the square footage and the land. Whereas in the mainland of Europe, people are much better about soundproofing. And also, and you're lucky being in Edinburgh, but a country where so much of our housing is houses, not apartments, which are inefficient to do. other places have achieved it better and are achieving it. I think you also need to persuade the population that this is a major achievement, it's a big thing, it's not boring. That the increase in the standard of living in the future for having a better insulated home, not just that you'll be wasting less money heating it, but in those hot summers to come, your home will be cooler, is enormous. And it's this quite a very conservative thing. This is doing something now for the good, you know, of the future to do. And it's difficult. Reform are going to use petrol prices. You almost see it in their planning. They're going to try and go for the kind of protests of, we will come in and we will take down the cost of petrol so that you can drive as much as you want for as cheaply as you want because you shouldn't have to. Right? Our roads are full anyway. Increasing numbers of young people don't have a driving licence or a car. We need a transport system, which means you don't have to drive. This isn't fantasy. For the last 30 to 40 years, the number of people driving in Japan has dropped every year. You don't need to drive in countries like that. I've been to China only twice in my life. I went a few years ago and I was shocked at how many cars there were and how big they were. Much bigger than the cars in Oxford. This was a car-making town in the north of China. I went back in January this year and I was utterly shocked by the electric bikes everywhere. And I had to get an electric bike for the first time in my life because I'd just flown into the country, because after we took a series of trains to get to where I was staying, the last mile and a half you do on an electric bike. You don't walk it because it's too complicated to walk because the roads go straight. So you've gone in China from a country which famously everybody cycled in the past to cars to back to bikes again. But things can change really, really quickly. But we need to work out how to do that. You do not want to be like the USA and your future is you've got to be able to drive everywhere in your own little private 1 ton of glass and steel, you know, in a position where you're most likely to harm yourself or somebody else. You know, it is not a rational way to be. Doesn't mean we won't have cars, but it should be possible for those of you who are choosing, I'm not going to take my driving test now or later, to actually live the rest of your life without being able to drive a car. You know, that should be something where you don't feel bad that you've chosen to do that.
Right, we've got another 25 minutes or so. Anybody looking to make their maiden speech in the chamber has 25 minutes or so to work out what it is they want to say. I've got the lady there. Have we got any other hands up at the moment? And then at the front there. So we'll take these two, and then I'll come to you, man.
Yeah, Danny, you mentioned the importance of the family influence on whether a young person will change their views. I observed, hopefully, a little bit of uncomfortable body language amongst younger members of the audience here. But do you have any comments or research? Do you think that TikTok, the digital world, influencers like Andrew Tate may now be a bigger influence than our families on views in adult life?
Oh,
thank you.
Can I do that one quickly? When I remember? Okay.
Of course.
Yeah, so we've had brilliant surveys of elections for, well, since the 1950s, first election survey, and it used to be that the biggest predictor of how you vote would be how your father voted. Not just your parents, your father. You know, 75% of people voted the way in it. It's a bit like religion, you know, your religion is likely to be your parents' religion, but this is how people said they voted. You've got to remember, I always think people might sneakily have done something different in the ballot box, and even in the survey. But anyway, that dominance was huge, and it has reduced, but we're still greatly affected by our families and by our schools. I wrote a book with a nice young man who went to Eton. He got to Eton on the King's Scholarship, so he actually came from a normal background. He was the only Labour supporting person in the political debate at Eton College. And he supported Liz Kendall, which may, anyway, on the right of Labour. Bless him. You know, we like to think that we're independent thinkers, but we are entirely a product of the information we get around us, almost entirely. We can look at the outside influence. What I mean by the forming is you tend to form your views at about 15, 16, change a little bit about 18. I don't worry about influencing my undergraduates. I think they've largely decided what they believe in, and I won't alter them very much. But you're still thinking, and some people do have road to Damascus conversions and switch from one side to the other. But we largely agree with that. What has there been? Recently, in recent elections across Europe, we've watched young women move towards the left and towards Greens. And we've seen it's still small. We get petrified about it, but we've seen a small rise in young men move to the far right. It really matters, because this matters for voting for, 60 years. It doesn't really matter that much if your 80 or 90-year-olds suddenly change their political opinions, because they're only going to be around for another election, right? But it does really matter. Even in Finland, that country I'm celebrating, there's a group called the Young Lions of men who have little lion badges, who say their slogan is, "We make the cake, you eat the cake." As in, somebody like me, you can see, I'm not productive, I don't actually make things, I'm just a leech. Whereas a proper working man is a working man. And that's the kind of Andrew Tate stuff, and then the misogyny. I'm not pessimistic about this, because I think if you step back and look at surveys over a long period of time, a survey question we've asked since the 50s, how would you feel about your child bringing home a boyfriend or girlfriend of a different race to you, right? That question has progressively shown greater and greater progress. We still have a small number of people, mainly old, who say, it would be terrible if my child brought home somebody and married somebody of a different race, but it's going. Views about violence are generally getting more progressive. So I'm hopeful. You've got to be wary of it. And the position of men is changing very quickly as well, right? But I'm not going to be sympathetic to men and say, it's really terrible that you are having to compete with women for things now, and it's not just handed you on a plate. And that old world in which there were jobs for men and men got jobs wasn't necessarily brilliant, because that's what you had to do. The only way you could succeed as a man was in the world of work. You couldn't stay at home and look after children. That wasn't an option, so it wasn't necessarily great.
I'm not sure the Young Lions in Finland had heard that you were second hardest in third year. They would have been less dismissive of them if they had. Coming to the woman in the front row here, and then we'll try and get the woman in the third row on the side there. On you go.
That's it,
Come on.
So in this chamber, the folk we elect here, it's proportional representation. And it's kind of complicated. And it can be complicated trying to work out who to vote for the list vote. These are the Conservative front benches. They wouldn't win if it was first past the post. So I'm just wondering, how different would the results of your research for the UK be if Westminster, a very different kettle of fish, if there'd been 25 years of proportional representation down in Westminster?
Well, I mean, it could have come in after 1918. 1918 was when, Europe was in uproar. But a lot of our early PR across Europe came in then. We always tend to think that changes will make a huge difference. Classically, extending the franchise, giving women a vote, and they never tend to be as big a change as you'd expect. So UK-wide, we're barely a democracy. First past the post is hardly democratic as a system. Hardly anybody gets what they vote for. Only a small minority of people get represented by the party that they actually voted for. Of course, we have a second chamber, which is unelected. We're the only other country apart from Iran that has clerics in our legislative chamber. We had the City of London represented with all kinds of devious things are going on down in London, you know, which are incredibly backward. And mean that we don't get the kind of politics that you do get in those countries where child poverty is lower, people live longer, public transport works, housing quality is higher, and they have voting systems which are democratic. The least democratic country in the Western world is the United States, you know, their voting system. And there's a connection between having better voting systems and getting better politics. It'll come to Westminster at one point. It doesn't come because the winners seem to think they're going to carry on winning every time they get in. I can remember John McDonnell, when Labour was run by well, not run, it was run by the office always run it. But when Jeremy Corbyn was leader of the Labour Party and John McDonnell was his shadow chancellor, John McDonnell was in favour of PR and Jeremy wasn't sure. So even in that, what I see is quite a progressive, for old men, you know, it's odd. It's a ridiculous system. I don't know what, yeah. It's an utterly ridiculous system. It's dangerous because it wouldn't be that hard for reform to get a majority of seats. Because for somebody like me, all my life, how I vote has hardly mattered. The chances of my vote altering which politician get in have been tiny. I vote almost like for religious reasons, like going to church. I like doing it, it's something I do. When we offered people in England and the rest of the UK, but remember this is new in England, for the first time in their lives, a chance to vote where their vote would actually have an impact, right, on a very simple referendum. They behaved in a way we didn't predict at all because we gave, for many reasons, but one is, for the first time in our life, you got a vote where you could actually say, do you want things to change or stay the same? And go, I really want things to change. And 52% voted for change. The level of scepticism about voting is so high, Reform are able to put up candidates. They might not all be human beings or real people, but they did it. Rishi Sunak called the election early, I am sure, because he could see their rise in popularity, which is why he didn't wait to go. Labour only won the election in London because of reform. Everybody knows this. The Labour vote was lower than it was in the election before. First past the post would allow reform on just 35% of the vote to sweep in, or make a deal with Kemi if she's still there, or Jenrick, and don't stand against each other. And they're kind of almost guaranteed to get it. That's the danger. Don't want to depress you, but if they weren't, then thankfully they're bumbling fools, you know, who do things like see some people rowing around the coast and call the Coast Guard, and it turns out it's a set of former squaddies raising money for charity. You know, thankfully Reform MPs do fall out with each other. Thankfully, and you can see my politics, but thankfully the Conservative Party is not such a clever machine that it can work out what to do. But we're going to rely, if you don't like that politics, we're going to have to rely with first past the post on the inability of the Conservatives and the bumbliness of reform and the Mayfair men behind them not to end up with the most right-wing government in Europe and the money from America pushing this. You know, Elon gives them 50 million, yeah. And it's undemocratic. We shouldn't have a system that lets a few rich people simply buy our politics. And I'm not over-exaggerating. In one of the books I've written, I have a list of all the biggest political donors for an election. And that all the money was straight to the Conservative Party. It was buying an election. And other countries do not allow that level of interference. It should be about you.
I'm conscious that I'm a Liberal Democrat politician. We're discussing electoral reform. I find myself in my happy place. We will move on. I've got the lady at the third row back on the aisle side. I'm desperately trying to see if there's any hands over on this side of the room, but I'm not seeing any as yet. Given the time, I'm going to take a couple here. So I'll take yourself, and then I'll come to the lady there with the black top.
Okay, good morning. A secure home is an essential platform for family life, and yet we hear every day that we have a housing crisis in the United Kingdom. Can you say something from your housing policy experience about how we've got to this position, what the possible solutions are, and what we can learn from other countries? Thank you.
I'm going to pause you there. We're going to take the question there from the lady in the black. Yeah. Microphone's there.
You made a statement earlier in which you said, why don't we work harder to avoid stark inequalities in health? So my question to you as a researcher is, all that fantastic evidence, why is it not filtering through and into the minds of decision makers?
Housing. We were world leading in housing. We've been world leading at many things. We are world leading on health. There were only 6 small rich countries that had higher life expectancy than us in the 50s, and our population was bigger than them all together. You know, so we were world leading on education. We produced one of the first comprehensive education systems. People came from other European countries and copied it, and they're now at the top. And we were world leading on housing. We had the most effective social housing program in the world. We were partly world leading on these things because we were so rich. You know, it's not just that we had progressive politicians, but we were good. I grew up at a time when all my friends had security of tenure. Everybody I went to school with, and you couldn't necessarily tell, but either mum and dad had a mortgage or they're in a council house. And you can't be evicted from a council house. Nobody I grew up at a time when there were 3 old homeless men in the city who were tramps on the old tramping route. No young people are homeless, no tents, none of that. Right? It's entirely possible, and you see it in other places. So the last time I mentioned Finland, Finland used to have tens of thousands of homeless people, often drinking, sleeping in the heated toilets, because if you weren't sleeping in the heated public toilets, you died in Finland, right? Finland now has, and they get annoyed, you don't say none, you say 6 or 8. They know the names of the homeless people, right? Had a program to get rid of homelessness. It is entirely possible to do. So, you can look at other countries and particular cities, or you can look at the Netherlands or Vienna and do it, or you can look back at our past. We have accepted that somehow it's okay to have the situation. When I was a student, private rentals were almost gone. The only people who rented privately were university students and well-off professionals, and we had hardly any private sector. The Assured Short-Hold Tenancy Act was introduced in the 1980s. It was never introduced, I'm sure, with the plan that this would become the tenure of around about 1/3 of children in England. So 1/3 of children in England now live in housing in which their parents can receive a letter and they've got to be out in 8 weeks. It's unbelievable, and it was mainly stupidity. I honestly don't think that it was introduced thinking this will be what happens for families with children. And their families, if you're living in the south, their rent in the private sector is double what the mortgage would be on the same house. So that the money can go, only about 2-3% of people are landlords. I'm not very good about private landlords. And, you know, that extra money is paying for cruise holidays and other things for landlords. Right? It's really cruel, and we shouldn't do it. Why doesn't the effect? I think people are sometimes a bit too polite. I try to be polite. I try to be kind, but I think I think there's for some reason we don't call these things out and say it's really bad. You know, insecurity of tenure, and the worst situation for kids is private rented housing, some of it appalling conditions that actually hasten the deaths. And also a disconnect. You know, your well-off middle-class researchers like me might get promoted to be a professor because we've written another paper about health inequalities in the British Medical Journal. But we don't have an anger that goes, you know, that little boy who died, I think he was in 9 months, next to his father, you know, we don't have an anger about it. And I suspect that's partly why we've ended up in this current situation. If you go back to the period in the 30s and 40s, where we really changed the curve from being a very, very unequal country with a terrible record on health in the 1930s, to being a country that largely eradicated poverty by the 50s and did all these things, there were politicians who were extremely angry. The famous one is Aneurin Bevan for the health service, who lost his siblings who died as children because they couldn't see the doctor. And if you don't have that kind of anger in your politics as well to drive you forward, there's a danger that you get. Our health secretary for a long time at the period where we were ignoring health inequalities was Jeremy Hunt. The son of an admiral who thought it was really hard to live on an income of below £100,000 a year. Right? He was just disconnected from society. His company, Hot Courses, which makes money out of your fear about where do I do a masters in the world, had made him a multi-millionaire. He grew up estranged from society. He has no idea, and we end up with him as health secretary as our infant mortality rises. Yeah, and it's not Jeremy Hunt's fault. We should never have put somebody in that position who knew so little about what he was doing. And it may sound a bit mean, but you know, don't blame the ignorant politicians like George Osborne. Blame us for how on earth did we put somebody like George Osborne, Magdalen College, Oxford, didn't go to Eton, slightly minor one, family work, you know. How do you put somebody whose life experience is so poor that he can do the things that he did into that position of power? And rather than be angry with them and angry with the bad politicians, like Nigel Farage, we should be angry with ourselves for letting it be possible that they could have these positions of power and then make the mistakes that they've done. We've got it wrong. The Assured Short-Hold Tenancy Act in the 80s, I actually blame the left wing of this country, and myself and my parents. It wasn't that the Conservative Party was the most successful political party in history, being elected and living and succeeding for so long and still managing to have some people sitting there. We've had the most divided progressive politics in Europe in many ways. Progressive politics was the Liberal Party, Rowntree Foundation supported them, and then we have a split of Liberal and Labour, and then Labour split with the SNP in the 80s, SDP, sorry, SNP's a different thing, SDP and Labour, splitting, split with the Greens. You know, our lack of ability to do what other European countries have done politically, and we blame it on our incredibly able right wing. I think we should actually say we get something wrong. And again, it may be our history, because the tanks never came over. We never lost a war. We didn't have a situation. The fastest way to get progressive politics is to lose a war. If you lose a war, you get rid of your elite, right? Nobody wants them back again. And hence Japan goes from being one of the most unequal to one of the most equal countries in the world, partly with the help of America, redistribution of land. Germany changes dramatically after the war. Finland lost a war on the side of Germany. If the tanks roll over and you're invaded, you don't necessarily trust the people who are supposed to protect you. That didn't happen to the UK. You know, when I'm being, so there are reasons why our politics are not good. We still have counties in England where the families that were given the land 1,000 years ago by William the Conqueror own most of it, right? And that's part of what's so hard to change things. But when young people were made, and particularly young men, were made to go and fight in a world war for a second time that this country could have averted, when they came back, they'd had enough of the people who had ruled them before, and we did change things in the 40s and 50s. So it's possible, but you've got to be angry and you've got to be bothered. And you've got not to be lethargic, and you've got to realise it's possible.
A call to arms, to be angry and bothered. It's a good way to finish. Can I thank you all for your contributions to the Q&A. We need to wind up there. I'd like to thank all of you for taking part, but especially thank Professor Danny Dorling for giving his time to take part in Partners, Scottish Futures Forum and the David Hume Institute. And I'd remind everybody to complete the questionnaires, either using the QR code or there are hard copy versions. Your feedback on events like this is really invaluable in terms of planning future festival events. Can I also remind you that Danny's work is not complete here. He has very generously offered to be down in the garden lobby where copies of his book, The Next Crisis, are available in the Festival Cafe bookshop, and he'd be happy to sign those. And his work will not stop there either, as he's joining us on a panel this afternoon on Gen Z and politics, which starts at 3 p.m. There are many, many other events taking place in the festival that runs through until tomorrow, so do please take a look at the programme, as there is undoubtedly something else there that may tickle your fancy. But for now, can I ask you once again to put your hands together and thank our guest, Danny Dorling.